All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I know some of you may still be joining us, but we have quite a bit to cover today, so we want to go ahead and get started. I am Theresa Conti. I'm a senior consultant with July Business Services. Joining me today is Quintan Kocher. He's with advisory services with Expand Financial. So we are going to talk today all about mastering the boardroom and really talk in depth about effective retirement plan committee meetings. There's a lot that you should know, a lot to consider definitely when we are talking about committee meetings. And so we want to just cover some of those kind of things. Here's a little information about July in case you're not as familiar with us, or maybe you are, and we appreciate that. But we really wanted to talk today about retirement plan committees. So here's a little agenda that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk what is a committee, what we cover in meetings. We're going to talk a lot about participant needs because participants have a lot of needs. There's a lot of good stuff that you can give them and help to add value to them and help them really prepare for retirement, and how to address fiduciary responsibilities, because that's definitely a big one. I'm going to get started by doing a quick poll, if you don't mind. And what we want to know is, do you conduct, oh, I think I started the wrong one. I'm so sorry. Let me start that again. I apologize. I wanted to start, oh, let me go back. Sorry. Here we go. Sorry. Do you, darn it, it may not let me go. Are you seeing the poll, Quintan?
It came up. It was
It came up, but now it won't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to know, and I'm sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. But I wanted to launch if you work currently with retirement plan committees, just to kind of get a sense of what you're working on. So if you want to drop a note in the chat, if you are working with them or not working with them, that would be helpful to us, just so we kind of know. And if you have any questions throughout this whole presentation, please feel free to drop a note in the chat or the Q&A, and we will stop and get that answered for you, because we're going to be covering a lot of different things. So there may definitely be some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Between Theresa and I, we'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat log. So feel free to type them in there. We'll stop in the middle and give you some answers.
Yep, for sure. So let's talk first about what is a retirement plan committee. Okay, they are actually responsible for overseeing the retirement plan, and you may work with plans and may not have a committee, and sometimes that's okay. But one of the best practices that I would say is a best practice is that you do have some sort of committee, right? It may consist of the plan sponsor, the trustees, another fiduciary, could be the advisor, right, is typically part of that committee, could be others in there. And typically that committee then is named in the plan document, right? Who's part of that committee and who is overseeing some of the plan things. And we're going to talk a lot more in depth about those in a little bit. Oh. Quintan, did you want to talk about this a little bit, about, the basics of committee?
Sure. There are a couple people already chiming in that they do work with committees. One attendee asked, will the slides be sent to participants after the call? I believe the answer is yes on that.
Yes.
So yes, I will address that one as well. So yeah, so typically, like the slide says, they have around 5 members. I've had investment committees that have as little as 3 members. I've had investment committees that have up to 10 members. A lot of that's kind of dependent on the size of the plan, the demographics revolving around those investment committees, and a lot of times it just depends on the industry and how many people want to be involved, right? So the owner, CFO, head of HR, the typical candidates that are right in line to get started. Sometimes you might bring in higher level employees, or somebody that has an investment expertise or something like that into the committee, but in most cases those are your primary targets. During a meeting, obviously you want to do an agenda, go through all the touch points to those providers, making sure everything's working the way it's supposed to happen. And then it's key to obviously make sure you're keeping detailed minutes, because the plan were to go through a DOL audit or anything like that, that's one of the first things they're going to look for is, do you have an investment committee meeting? When was the last time you met? What did you cover? And having those things in the files to reference are great. Frequency depends on the employer, Theresa. I think on my end, Most of them are twice a year, some of them once a year, but in most commonly 2 times a year. I've had as many as four. Normally, sometimes you'll do quarterly. Interested to get what you've seen on your end.
Yeah. So a couple things. One is I agree with you. I think by far most plan sponsors do them at least twice a year, right? I think that that's really something you should do. Look at things, and I think there's a couple of times a year where things are really prevalent, and we'll talk about those a little bit, like some of the operational things and things that come up as we go on. One of the other things on here we talked about typically having 5 members. I mean, and that can really vary, right, Quintan? Like if we have a very
Absolutely.
small plan, it could be 3 people. And if we have a really large plan, it could be, 10 people, which
Right.
is probably a lot, but you could, right? Those could vary quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I think it's important, as an advisor, when you're developing these committees, anybody that gets pulled into that room has some liability on that committee. So a lot of times, most employers are going to keep it pretty small, but it depends on, the needs of the employees and the importance of having some of those employees on the committee. So wide ranges, but definitely around five is probably average in my experience.
Well, and one of the other questions I've heard plan sponsors ask sometimes is, should we have just a rank and file employee on this committee? Should we
Right.
keep it, all more like management type people, CFOs, head of HR, like that we've talked about? But what's your thought about having more of a just a rank and file employee on that committee?
Typically, we shy away from it. One, because you're trying to keep these meetings concise, you're trying to keep them very focused. And like I mentioned, if you do bring in somebody rank and file, there is some personal liability there. If something were to go astray, something goes wrong, anybody that's sitting on that investment committee has some liability. So rank and files typically don't get involved, but some sponsors I've seen be pretty dead set on having a voice of the people, for better lack of better words, on that committee so that they can see how employees are really feeling. What I try to tell sponsors is let's not have them on the committee, but let's make sure they're more involved when we're planning participant need education. What do you think is most important to get messaging to those participants? Is it financial wellness training? Is it budgeting? Those types of things. I know we're going to cover some of that stuff
Yeah.
later, but that's kind of where I focus. When a sponsor is asking me, I try to shy away from the rank and file. I try to keep those meeting or the investment committee concise and a tight knit group as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I actually 100% agree with that philosophy. So let's talk really quickly about the meeting, right? Let's talk about things that may drive where your meeting goes, right? And I know that these are some of the things you typically ask, and I think they're super important, right? Has something changed in their business, right? Have the participants changed, especially in numbers? We see it all the time. If you go from 5 employees to 50 employees or 50 employees to 5 employees, that may create a big change in what the needs are. And how about that engagement with the participants? So, can you talk a little bit, maybe more in depth, about some of these things that you really talk about with plan sponsors?
Yeah, and I think, talking about the business being changed, I've seen so many different things over the course of running or being parts of committee meetings over the years. And, the thing that's becoming more and more prevalent in the last 2 or 3 years is, discussions about M&A. Are you looking to sell the business, or what's your, continued business succession planning? Or do you have another generation you're handing this stuff off to? Are you planning on selling the business to get out of it? That can really change the needs of not just the participants in those plans, but talking about the potential changes during an acquisition. How does that stuff happen? How does it go along? So we're seeing more and more of that in the last few years. On the participant side, getting a feel for how the participants are reacting to the plan itself. Do they have a really good warm feeling about the plan? Hey, this is a great benefit. We kind of know how to use it. Do they not know who their providers are? Do they not know how do you log in? How do you create an account? Like, um, sometimes it's just as simple as a group education meeting, kind of going through, hey, here's your plan. If you don't understand it, let's answer the questions in a group setting. Sometimes it's more personalized. Maybe there's a handful of employees that need help with budgeting. Maybe they need help with financial wellness in general, or talking about, maybe you have a small group of employees that are phasing into retirement and trying to figure out, do I have enough money to save? All those different types of things can be brought up during these things to kind of focus on what's going to be most impactful for those participants. So that's kind of the second and third question kind of go hand in hand there as far as how do we get participants engaged and make sure they're feeling good about the plan.
Yeah, for sure. Right. So let's talk about the meeting and some of the questions. Oh, sorry, I thought my slide went. Sorry. What should be covered in every meeting? And I think we have a couple big topics that we're going to bring up. First is operations, and we're going to talk a lot more in depth about that. We're going to talk about doing a regular kind of plan review. And again, we'll talk about that. And then participant needs. And we talked a little about that already, but I think it's some really important things. So I know you cover all of these really kind of at every meeting. I have heard of strategies where, if you're doing quarterly meetings, in one quarter, you might cover more operational, and in the next quarter, you might cover a plan review, and in the next quarter, you might so I have heard strategies where, you may cover just one big topic like at each of your meetings, but I actually really like this where you're kind of covering everything. And sometimes you may spend more time on operations than plan review and vice versa, right? So, any thoughts here about this?
No, I think you're right on track. And I think a lot of it's dependent on how the opening part of that meeting goes. If the first thing they bring up during investment committee is, oh, our record keeper hasn't been, getting us the things that we need in time. So, hey, let's talk about operations. Let's make sure that your year-end stuff is going on a path. And we might dedicate the entire meeting to focusing on that. What we like to do is kind of touch on all three of them at a high level and see which one is most important to them during that specific meeting, and then focus most of the energy of that meeting on that particular one. But we kind of have the same agendas that we'll go through, but they might change tweak-wise based on what we're hearing from the committee itself when we open up that dialogue.
100%. So when we talk about operations, I'll kind of cover this slide. So when we talk about operational things, right, we talk about compliance, right? At this time of year, after March 15th, a lot of plans have their compliance testing done. Do we want to talk about, did the ADP test fail? Did something else go on? Something else we may need to talk about at this meeting, that's coming up for the end of first quarter, or maybe you're doing your review meeting in June, but you should definitely be looking at that compliance testing that happened for the prior year, because that'll also set what we might need to change, in a future year as well, and set up the stage for that, right? Something for us to remember, something for us to talk about closer to the end of the year.
No, absolutely. And these things are such a timing mechanism, right? Because every year these sponsors are getting these, hey, we need a census, hey, we need a questionnaire answered, all those things that TPAs and record keepers are sending out, and they get overwhelmed, right? So they get paralysis, and they're afraid of what they're doing. Sometimes they lose track of it and things can fall behind. But with the compliance deadlines, obviously 5,500 deadlines are approaching in the summer. Funding deadlines, if they're planning on doing profit sharing contributions in the prior year, all those types of things are super important in that first quarter. We have a lot of advisors that we work with that try to do, if they are one a year type of meetings, they try to do them in the first quarter, because that's when the most stuff is flying at that sponsor. You want to make sure that they're well taken care of during that period of time, because some of them might be getting ADP refunds. Have you looked at safe harbor? Do we need to add safe harbor? All those things there's much more timing flexibility addressing that stuff in the first quarter than when you get to the third quarter and you have safe harbor deadlines popping up, and then you have to make a decision right there. If you bring them up earlier in the year, you can kind of talk through them and set the expectations on when things need to be done.
Right. And set, the thought process. It gives them a little bit of time. If they're going to switch to safe harbor, they may want to look at some projections of what that could cost, or other types of things, right? Same thing, you mentioned employer contributions and census. This is a big time of year for that, right? We're collecting census and all those clients. You mentioned it, maybe they're going to make a profit sharing, maybe they're considering doing that, or some other form of non-elective. Lots of stuff going on, and lots of things as an advisor you can really help them have that conversation with. The other thing there is the other service provider review, right? Who are they using as other service providers? Okay, you're the advisor. who's their TPA, who's the record keeper, right? What's going on with them? And do we have any pain points? Do we have anything else that we may need to talk or think about or look at, or, those kind of things. So I think having an open mind about that is important as well.
Hey, Teresa,
Yeah,
before
go
we,
ahead. Yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
just pause. So Karen just said the chat says that it's disabled. Is that something that I haven't seen
Well,
anything come through on the chat, but it says disabled. So I don't know if
I
it's a
thought
setting.
I had fixed it. So I have it set now where panelists can chat with everyone and attendees should be able to chat with everyone.
Yep, we
And
just got
Bruce is chatting. So
Yep,
yeah, I think
perfect.
I fixed it. Okay, good.
Awesome.
Sometimes it just doesn't like it at the beginning.
No
So,
worries. I just wanted to make sure it was open.
okay, yeah, no worries. The other one is potential opportunities, right? And opportunities can be any number of things. I think you mentioned some of them, like should we be looking at safe harbor? Did the employer have a really good year last year and maybe want to consider doing a non-elective profit sharing contribution, something like that?
Absolutely.
Or should we be, did they really have a good year and maybe want to add
Cash balance.
a cash balance or something like that. So keeping your mind open to those other opportunities, right, is really important as well, and really listening to what that plan sponsor has to say. I think that sets the stage from the one of the first slides we talked about, where talking about what's important to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then as you get comfortable doing these types of meetings, you'll hear things and they might mention, oh man, I really don't want to pay this huge amount to the IRS. Oh,
Yep.
let's look at that. Have you ever considered doing profit sharing? What kind of demographics do you have? As an advisor, you kind of know what the demographics look like from a plan perspective, but working with the TPAs and the record keepers and the outside parties to get some just analysis done. Most of your TPAs are going to do illustrations for free on those.
Yep. Yep.
To at least give them something to look at, right? So those types of opportunities doesn't really work in every sense, but sometimes they're going to say something that can trigger, oh, I might have a solution for that. And more as an advisor, you can provide value and sell yourself as, hey, we're not just this, we can do this, this, and this as well. Opens up more and more doors. So, and it creates a stickiness between the advisor and the client.
For sure. And I would also tell you too, when you're talking about the other service providers, sometimes you need to bring them in. Sometimes they need to be
Yeah.
part of those meetings, particularly if there's something going on or something you want to discuss. Or my next thing here is, legislative changes, right? As the advisor, it's you should know what's going on legislatively, but you may not know every minute detail. And that's really the responsibility of the TPA a lot of times, right? We really look at that, see what needs to we look at, what might change, what might work well for that client, right? There's a lot going on right now, especially with Secure 2.0. There were a lot of changes, a lot of things happening, still a lot of things happening. I think I talk about it almost every single day in one form or
In
another.
some way, shape, or form. That's all I was going to say. And bringing other parties in is a great point, because an advisor, I might understand Secure 2.0, but that doesn't mean we understand exactly how everything's getting implemented with that particular record keeper or with that particular TPA. With some of these changes to, Roth catch-ups and long-term part-time employees is the big topic right now, and
Right.
how that affects future plans. Like, every provider is going to put them in place in different ways, right? And
Right.
understand how that particular provider is going to manage those things is important, not just for you, but for the client too.
Right.
So yeah,
And there's plenty of times too where we have to say, we don't have enough guidance to be able to really tell you how this should work. The one provision that was out there was, if I made a match to my employees or a profit sharing and they wanted to now make it be Roth, how do we make that work? We didn't have guidance for a long, long time on how to make something like that work, right? Because it is complicated and there's a lot of stuff going on. There were, 193 provisions in Secure 2.0. So it's a ridiculous amount. So just something to keep it.
Things aren't the ones that have to implement them either. So
that's right. And implementation is a whole different thing than, just saying, okay, now it's available. We have to be able to do it.
Right.
So
right.
For sure. Okay, let's move on. And Quintan, I'm going to let you kind of cover this, talking about a plan review. So first we have investments.
Yeah, so on the investment side, so Expand Financial, we do this all the time. We have a proprietary software that we use to monitor investments, and we provide those quarterly reports out to our clients as a 338 provider. But essentially, at a high level, you just want to make sure, is there an IPS? if there is an IPS, are the investments within the plan following the IPS? Are there any fund changes that need to be made? Are the participants using the funds the way they should? Like, one of the things we look for, like when we're running our reports and when we're reviewing our reports, is are there any weird instances? Like, have we seen a lot of flows go out and into money market, for instance? Like when the market's going south, a lot of people will panic. If you see that within a plan, it's a good time to have a group education and talk about those types of things. Same thing going the other way. Tech had a huge year in 2023. So a lot of employees and participants within plans, they'll look at 1 year, 3 year, 5 year performance. They see a good number. They're like, oh, I'm going to move all my money there. That's not necessarily a great tactic. So making sure you're informed about how those investments are flowing and making sure that they're staying within the realm of the IPS is the most important pieces to cover when you're looking at an investment committee. Obviously, so much goes into the investments and how lineups are built, and are we covering the right style boxes and all those things. But from an advisor's perspective, when you're meeting with a sponsor to review, hey, here's the IPS. We're managing it to the IPS. No fund changes needed. Let's take a look at how they're being used. Other than that's really high level when we're talking investment committee meetings. But I know it says investment committee, but a lot of times we're not just reviewing investments. We're talking about plan health at a high level. This next item, annual cost review. This is something we try to do with all of our clients. The more you can show them their fees, the better off you're going to be long run with a client, because they're getting calls. Like they're getting calls monthly, probably asking them, hey, have you looked at your 401k? Let us help look at them. Like, especially in the 5 million above market, they're getting contacted all the time. So the more you can be transparent with them, show them what their costs are, make sure that they're under benchmark, the better off you're going to be as an advisor. Once again, creating that stickiness. Participant statistics, I just kind of mentioned that during the investment pieces, not just what investments are they using, but are they investing? What kind of participation rates are being used? What are your average deferral percentages? Looking at demographics by age. And we have a couple slides that we'll show here in a little while about that. But just key things like that at a high level can keep a committee very informed about how participants are using the plan, and are they getting the best of the best when they're using it, right? Are they using it to their best ability?
So I know you talked about investment policy statement when you talked about investments. I have a question. I always have this question. So I'd love your take on it. So, if a plan, do plans need an investment policy statement? Should they have one, number one? And number two, if they do have one, what rules should they follow? Like what? Because I think that there's some very specific things there that you should talk about.
So best practice is, a plan should have some type of investment policy statement. It is not 100% required. If you're not going to require investment policy statement, you need to be very restrictive as far as what kind of investments you're putting into those plans, because it can cause harm, right? If you're throwing in, alternatives or hedges or anything like that within a plan, and you're giving participants access to them, you're going to want an investment policy statement. As far as managing them, everybody uses different rules and methodology as far as an investment policy statement. If you're working with a 338, such as Expand or any of them out there, they're going to typically manage an investment policy statement for you. If you're not working with a 338 and you're operating as an advisor for an investment policy statement, creating that investment policy statement is really revolving around how you're managing the lineup. What kind of factors are you looking at? Are you using FI360? Are you using RPEG? Are you using Morningstar? What software? How are you grading those funds and making sure that they're in the best interest of the clients, and making sure you're adhering to that investment policy statement? So the first question was, do you need one? Not 100%, probably best practice if you do. The follow-up is, if you do have one, you need to make sure you're adhering to it, right? And that's the most important piece, especially in case of audits or things like that pop up.
Yeah. So really quickly, I know one of the questions I always got a lot is about investments. What about oddball investments? Like, everybody's talking about Bitcoin and, other types of things. And one of the big ones we always had was like, the owner wants a self-directed brokerage account in the plan. Like what's your, I mean, and I know like self-directed brokerage, we have lots of plans who did that. I don't know that was really a best practice, not something I really love to do. And as an administrator, I really didn't love them. Right. But what do you see, and what do you think about some of those things?
Yeah, so self-directed brokerage accounts can create issues, but as long as you're offering, if you offer a self-directed brokerage account, you need to make sure you're offering it to everybody equally, right? We can't just allow owners in it and not the staff, right? You have to give everybody the same equal opportunity to use those. So that's the biggest flaw I normally see with self-directed brokerage. Once it's in there, there's still some oversight liability. You want to make sure they're not using options trading or margins and things like that. But if they want to set up a self-directed brokerage account and invest in Bitcoin, typically we're not going to say, no, you can't do that. Oddball investments within the plan, they can create harm, and it does provide more scrutiny. We have stayed away from Bitcoin ETFs and those types of things due to the volatility in nature. If participants don't know how to use them and they harm themselves in ways, shapes, or forms as a 338 or as an investment committee, you become liable for those things, and it can create lawsuits. We try to stray away from them from time to time. We typically will have a core lineup we're using for most of our plans. Some plans are very adamant about having certain things, whether it be real estate or precious metals or hedges, whatever the case may be, as long as they're going to pass screens and it's something that we can keep a close eye on and we can educate the participants about how to use them, we're okay with them. But just make sure that that investment policy statement's covering you for those additional asset classes that you're bringing in. I
So
see we do have,
yeah, I was going to just ask you that. We have a question in the Q&A about
yeah,
338s. And, if you're using a 338 in a plan, right, what's the responsibility of the plan sponsor about the funds? Is that
yeah,
all the 338's responsibility then?
technically, yeah. So the 338 is going to remove that liability, and all fund changes and processes are going to be handled by them. That's their role as a 338. So I think the question said, do we need to stress? No, but as a service provider on the plane, you need to be aware and normally your 338, if they're doing their job, they're going to keep you informed. If we're removing a fund, here's why, here's what we're going to move it to, making sure the committee is aware, making sure the advisor's aware as far as what the methodology is, what the processes are. Because at the end of the day, the trustees and the investment committee essentially that's overseeing this 401k plan, they may not have that 338 liability anymore, but they still have the fiduciary liability to make sure that service providers are doing their job, right? So you're still managing that 338. If that 338 fails, it's your duty, fiduciary duty, to remove that 338 and put a new one in place or take it out or whatever the case may be. So you're still managing the service provider themselves, but from a high level, no, as an advisor, you shouldn't be stressing about investments if you have a 338 in play. That's technically their job.
Awesome. All right, let's spend a minute talking about some of these reports. Now, clearly, this is a fairly new plan, but I think you wanted to cover a few things here and maybe
Yep.
almost a success story of something you used in a meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually a live plan that it's only been around for about a year. He started it in 2023 and kind of got to the end of 2023, and we were doing our review and we're like, man, this participation rate, you can see, end of the third quarter was 11%. We said, one, let us get in there and let's do some education, but two, have you considered doing a match? Right. And he's like, well, when we set up the plan, we weren't really sure whether we wanted to do a match. We do have the cash flow. Let's set up a discretionary match. We kind of backed into a formula for him. So this particular employer decided to do a 50% match on the first 3%. Not a huge amount, but like you just by doing that education in the fourth quarter, getting participants more aware and giving them a heads up at, hey, we're going to be implementing a match in 2024. That starts to increase the participation. And when we run that first quarter report in March, I would expect that participation rate is probably going to be in the north of 60%. So this is an insurance company, pretty small firm for the most part, but you can see just by looking at this stuff and bringing it up, it can create conversations around matches. The other thing on here that this plan doesn't have them in place, but loans, are people using loans, or did we see a wide jump in loans? So there's a lot of cool information on this page, and this is July's example. Pretty much every provider out there has their own version of this. Some type of an executive summary or quarterly plan report or whatever they call it, and just looking at those statistics and making the sponsor aware of them and creating conversations can lead to good outcomes for the sponsor and for the participants.
And then you have this one about a little more about participation. I like this one because I
Love
love to see how the different age groups, right, have different things. Like even in this example, 50% of the people between 55 and 64 were participating. It's the youngers who were not for the most part,
Yep,
right?
this is such a cool page, and this is following the first slide, and we kind of touched on this earlier when we're talking about participant needs within a plan. Looking at this and seeing, hey, my younger staff doesn't realize the benefit they're getting here. Even if a plan doesn't have a match, investing in retirement is still important for those employees. Let's do an education. Looking at those participation rates, looking at average deferral rates and average account balances, you can kind of see who's saving, who's not. What kind of demographic do we need to focus our education on to try to improve the plan? So this is a great slide. I agree with you 100%. This is one of our most commonly used pages out of those provider quarterly plan reports, is looking at age group statistics and seeing how, because the other cool thing that this one will do as well for the advisors that like to look at rollover potential and people that are planning for retirement, you can see those 65 plus or the 55 to 64 range, how many people are in that group? What are their average account balances? How do I approach those guys to make sure that they're comfortable with their retirement savings plan going forward?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly, I wanted to, we had done that poll question. Can you see the poll results?
Yeah,
Can you
so
see
do you
those?
conduct
Okay.
employee meetings?
Yeah.
So we've got yes, general plan meetings is 16 out of 20.
Right.
Overall financial wellness, 11 out of 20. Debt
Yeah.
management, a little bit lower, 4 out of 20. Life events, 7 out of 20, and other meetings not listed above. So I'd be curious for those people that there's 5 that said other meetings not listed above. If you want to throw those into the chat, I'm always open. I like hearing what other advisors are doing out there. These are kind of the main ones that we see. But I'd love to hear what kind of other people. I know there's a lot of advisors out there that are partnering with Ramsey Solutions and things like that to do financial wellness stuff. So completely interested in hearing what other advisors are out there doing.
So let's switch gears while they're talking about that. Let's switch gears to what participants need, right? Because I think there's definitely some needs that as an advisor and as a plan sponsor, right, they should be aware. The plan is really about the participants and helping them save for retirement. So I think it's such an important thing. And so what do our participants need? So they need some education. We're going to go into these in a little more depth in just a minute. They need some financial wellness, which again, people are like, what does that mean? But I think there's some very specific things that if you know your demographic and know your employee group, and the plan sponsor can help with that of what they need. And then, enrollment meetings, just kind of the general everyday enrollment meeting. And I don't think there's really such a thing as an everyday enrollment meeting anymore. I think it's probably changed a little bit in the past couple of years. So let's start a little bit with education. One of the things I always like to talk about is how are they getting to retirement? You talked about, how we talked in that a couple slides ago about how that, lower aged people, the younger people were the ones not participating. But I think that they see retirement as so far away. But if they started now, right? So talking to them about that could be very helpful to get them where they need to be ultimately, right? And by starting now, you can talk about the compounding and regular contributions going in and all those kind of things, right?
Yeah, same thing when you're talking to young people about Roth versus pre-tax. Roth and 401k has become more and more prevalent in the last 5 to 10 years, right? And making sure those younger people understand the benefits that you can get out of a Roth contribution in those early years, and as it continues to grow, getting that tax-free benefit in retirement. Definitely, the more you get in front of those participants, like I said earlier, even plans that don't offer a match, they need to understand that, a lot of their retirement wellness is going to be on them, right? Learning how to save and learning how to use the plan to their needs, even if the plan's not offering some type of huge benefit.
Right. And then targeting your meetings, right? Like we were talking about, content should relate to what's going to matter most with the participants. You talked about loans, right? I mean, I know a lot of plans offer loans. I understand why plans offer loans. I don't always love loans because sometimes they're hard to administer. And sometimes you get groups of people taking a ton of loans. This is retirement money. So I kind of sometimes feel differently, but I also understand that plan sponsors sometimes feel that participants need to have that. But having an education about that with the participants on why it might be bad to take a loan, right? Like could help too sometimes.
Absolutely. And a lot of times, when plans offer loans, it's not that, it's not with good intentions from a sponsor. They want people to have access to those dollars. But at the end of the day, if it's not being taken for the right reasons, there's so many penalties and issues if they can't pay back those loans. If they terminate employment, there's, making sure that they're aware of the downside if something were to happen. So loans are one of the more common things that we do education on, making sure they understand, how they operate, not necessarily as a benefit to them, but how it can hurt you as well.
For sure. So one of the others that I really like when we talk about kind of participant needs and financial wellness, right? The provider and the advisor working together to kind of figure out, right? Sometimes the TPA and the record keepers have some information, have
Yeah.
some of those statistics that we talked about earlier, what the participation rate is, what groups of employees are participating and which are not, right? That's really good stuff that can help you really figure out what participant needs are. And I think big things are, budgeting, things like life events, right? You have a new baby, you get divorced, any of those things can happen, right?
Yeah.
We talk a lot about debt in today's world, right? Student loan debt, credit card debt is kind of the highest I think it's ever been, right? And how
Yep.
to work with that. And really in just general savings. Sometimes these things, particularly in the younger people, are not talked about very much at school, or parents don't talk about them. So this is a really great way in my mind to talk about this. Any other thoughts here or things you see plan sponsors want?
No, I think you nailed it. These are the big ones, that we focus on when we're meeting with advisors and clients and things like that. It's providing the right education that fits the client needs. But these are the ones that come up very often: debt, budgeting, saving kind of goes hand in hand with everything around a 401k. Obviously, life events. How does that change? Do we need to update beneficiaries? I've seen issues where
Yes.
they get a divorce, they don't change their beneficiary. I think it might have been you that I was
Yeah,
talking to.
we had that once where a
Yeah.
guy did not change his beneficiary, and he had gotten and he was engaged to somebody, but then he died and his ex-wife got the money. And
Correct, yeah, like
that
those
shit.
types of things, and he probably had no idea that that was an issue when he passed away, and
Right.
then they go to unweave it, and, with the rules with the IRS and the DOL, you have to have your spouse as a beneficiary unless somebody signs off on it, so there should
Yep.
have been a form completed and signed off on, but
Yep.
since it
and
wasn't,
it,
it
and,
wasn't
and it
done.
is really a best practice, right, to
Yeah,
remind, a lot of the beneficiary stuff is online now, but to remind them to go in once a year and check that out and make sure they've updated it, or when something happens, right? I think a lot of people just forget about it, and
absolutely.
understandably, but it
When
does
people are
create
going
other
through those
situations.
types of changes, a lot of times 401k is in the very back of their mind. They're worried about
Mhm.
life insurance policies, houses,
Right.
all the stuff that they're touching every single day, and getting those updates. So 401k, it's like you might get 2 or 3 years down the road and be like, oh, did I ever update that? And without being updated, there's things that fall through the cracks. So
Right.
definitely important.
So I'd like you to spend a couple minutes talking about enrollment meetings, because I think enrollment meetings have kind of changed a little bit over time, and that they are. I think they're still important, but
Yeah.
what are you seeing now, and how does that process go?
Yeah, so an enrollment meeting, the way we typically will handle them with other advisors is a 338 is kind of a group meeting initially to kind of review the plan highlights, making sure everybody understands what the match is and what the vesting schedules are. Do they allow Roth? You know, what other, eligibility, vesting, everything from the beginning of the plan highlights to the end, right? Making sure everybody's comfortable. And then we'll kind of show them how to log in, how do you set up your account? Because everything in today's world is online enrollment. Very few are still doing paper. So a lot of times it's not that old school advisor sitting down one-on-one with you and filling out a form. You're doing it on a computer. You're setting up a user ID. You're setting up a password, making sure they're comfortable doing that. Spend some time on the investments, make sure they're comfortable and understanding that, and then kind of walk them through it. And then on a group setting, you might show them the demo on how to do it, and then offer one-on-one for support for anybody that wants it, right? And going through it that way. That's at a high level what we're handling on our end, knowing your audience, enlisting help of employee plan champion. Like when you say plan champion on the slide here, you're talking about somebody in that workforce, or maybe it's an HR person that's talking. And you know, I just ran into this actually. I had a meeting 2 days ago with one of our larger 401k plans. They had a new HR person come in, and he was a younger guy, but he was dead set, like, I'm going to improve these young people that just don't want to participate. I was like, I love it. So
Go
he's
for it.
going, he
Yep.
calls it hounding them, right? And hey, sign up for the plan. You need to take advantage of this. You know, having somebody within the organization, because as much as an advisor or third party administrator, you know, record keeper on these group meetings, you know, it's not a trusted voice a lot of times, right? From a participant. Like the sponsor trusts you as an advisor, the plan trusts you as a general concept, but you don't have that warm fuzzy a lot of times with the one-on-one participants because they've never really engaged with you before. So having somebody within the organization to kind of help foster those relationships and point them in the right direction has a huge impact on participation rates for sure.
And we used to have it too sometimes, right? I'm in Arizona, so we have a big Spanish speaking population, right? Mexicans and
Absolutely.
that, and so they're always at our, like when we used to do them in person a lot, we typically had somebody who could help translate, help
Yep.
encourage those people, same sort of thing. I mean, whatever that looks like in your particular plan sponsor, that having somebody there who understands or can hound them or whatever that looks like, right? Or help them understand maybe, those kind of things. So I think that's such a great point. I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about a fiduciary. I did a presentation a couple weeks ago for some plan sponsors, kind of a fiduciary training, because I think it is important that plan sponsors have some fiduciary training. And when we have a committee, it is important for them to understand what their responsibilities are. So I thought I'd just spend just a couple minutes reviewing the definition of fiduciary, who's a fiduciary, who's not, just to kind of update that in your mind. So if you're asked that by a plan sponsor, it can really help you. So a fiduciary is any person who has authority or control over the management of the plan or the assets, right? Renders investment advice for a fee. So as an advisor, you're often considered a fiduciary, gets compensation for it, right? And has any other discretionary authority in the administration of the plan. So when we talk about administration, that's a little bit of a on the line, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But so I love this slide, and I have one on the next slide, which is who is not a fiduciary. But who is a fiduciary is somebody who's named in the document. The employer is always a fiduciary, an officer who may be making plan decisions. A fiduciary, somebody who is a fiduciary by action, something they do makes them a fiduciary. It's when we talked earlier about that rank and file employee, right? They may just be a rank and file employee, but if we put them on that committee, they become a fiduciary, right? So something definitely to consider. Someone providing investment advice, somebody making key decisions, selecting investment options, right? Those are people who are fiduciaries. But there are some people who may work on the plan who are not fiduciaries. If you have an HR person who is just really determining who's becoming eligible, that doesn't necessarily make them a fiduciary because they didn't make that decision. They're just following the rules of the plan, right? Somebody providing, the census data is not going to be, or sending out some employee communications may not be, right? Somebody making those payroll contributions or doing those kind of things may not be. So just some distinctions there between who is a fiduciary and who isn't are kind of important a lot of times for you to remember and just think about, especially as you're working with committees. And that question does definitely come up. The other thing that we should talk about a little bit is what the responsibilities. I always say that committees should have some sort of training, at least annually. Could be as easy as just some reminders. When we did the fiduciary training a couple weeks ago, we talked about who is a fiduciary, kind of their responsibilities, other things that they should consider, things to think about. And then the other thing too, and we talked about this earlier, Quintan, when we have the committee, right, we should cover that committee or whoever's as a fiduciary with some fiduciary insurance. It's not very expensive. It just protects the plan. It protects the people who are on that committee, 100%. Right? It's a very important thing. And it is different than a bond, right? The bond that protects the assets. So a lot of you may understand what that bond is, but fiduciary insurance is actually insurance. Do you have experience? Do most of your committees have insurance? I would guess they do.
Either they've added it on to their E&O or they've added on to forget the other term that gets thrown around, DO or something like that. I'm not
Oh,
an
yeah,
insurance
D&O,
specialist.
director and officer,
Yeah.
usually.
So a
Yes.
lot of times it's some type of terminology with their broker. Hey, we're bringing so and so into the committee. Typically, the people that are on your committee are your key employees that you already have coverages in some way, shape, or form. So just making sure they're covered. I agree. The last thing you want to see is anybody on that committee, whether it's sponsor or a rank and file employee, become personally liable and have anything affect
For
them
sure.
personally. So make sure that everything's covered on that front. Like she said, it's not very expensive to do so. So just be aware of it and make sure that it's at least a talking point. Maybe you're
Correct.
setting up an investment committee with somebody. When they set up that committee, make sure, hey, who do you want on here? Try to keep it close knit, but those people that are added, you already have an E&O. Do you have a D&O coverage? Can we add anybody that's not on there? Let's add them to that just to make sure everything's
Well, and one
everybody's
of the things too, a lot of times, right, if we have like the HR manager or
yeah,
whatever, whoever that is, you may want to name them that way and not by person as well. And you may want to do that both from the committee charter standpoint, like who's on the committee, right? It's this person. Because if you have some turnover, then you don't have to update those all the time
I
either.
got you.
So,
Yeah, almost
so
as a role
that's
rather than
yes, a role
then
versus a named person. So
I like that
just
idea.
a little thing. Um, one other thing I like to talk about is that fiduciary file. Just some of the things that a plan sponsor and you should keep. And I think that between July and Expand, we have portals where we can keep a lot of this information, but this is just kind of a list of things that should always be part of that fiduciary file. The plan document, right? When we talk about government and regulatory requirements, that's the Form 5500 typically.
Yep.
The investment policy statement, the bond, the payroll, account statements, participant communications, right? If you're a safe harbor plan and you get audited, you may have to prove that you sent out a safe harbor notice. So those
Yep.
types of things, those communications, those notices, information about the other providers providing service to the plan, TPA, record keeper, advisor, right? Like those are things that need to be in there. And then information on the committee itself, the minutes that we talked about when we
Yep.
last met, what we talked about, those kind of things. So just some things really that are, again, best practices that every plan should have this information in a place where it can be accessed.
Absolutely. And having more information than less. A lot of this stuff you're only seeing once or twice a year. When
Right.
you're talking about 5,500 filings, once it's signed, you throw it in a file. It was filed on this date, and here's where here's the final pages or the draft or whatever. Same thing with your investment policy statement. Typically, that thing is not getting updated very often. So when you have it, put it in the file. You know, Creating the file is not the hard part, just remembering where it's at and making sure everything's where it needs to
And in
be.
the old days, it probably was a binder. Today, it's probably just in a
It's a
in a
folder.
network drive somewhere with all that information in it, right?
I remember when I first started in this industry. I know I'm fairly young, but I've been doing this for 13 years now. Even 13 years ago, you had binders like this that would sit on
Mm-hmm.
shelves, and you would have, hey, here's all the information that's been done. Here's the 5,500. Here's the census, all that stuff, and you would have one for each year. Now it's becoming a lot easier. Obviously, everybody's going to electronic. Most companies are working from home if they were doing remote stuff. So, yeah, pretty much everything's electronic. But having an archive of these things filed by year, that way, worst case scenario, a DOL audit pops up, you have it, right? They're going to say, hey, do you have your information from 2022? Here's the items we need. Oh, here's our fiduciary file,
Yep.
and check the box,
Right.
right? So,
For sure.
being more prepared than underprepared
Well,
is
nothing
always
overwhelms an auditor more than you sending them, 9,000 files, and they're like, okay,
yeah.
well, you must be doing okay because you got all
Right.
this stuff instead of, I got two things from you. So,
Not just sending them 9,000 things, but sending them within a day or two. Like, yeah,
yep,
I've got
for
that.
sure,
Here you go, right? And
for
they're
sure,
waiting for a month typically for most clients to gather this stuff. So
for
good
sure.
practice for sure.
Okay, let's just really quickly. This is just a little wrap up. Let's talk just kind of review kind of what we talked about from a best practice standpoint. Especially, and one of the things I know you kind of mentioned it, but I'd love for you to mention again that whole reminding the client of your value and what the costs in the plan are. So, can you talk just a little about this?
Absolutely. Reviewing costs is one of the most important things you can do with a client because then they feel comfortable that they're not overpaying. They don't need to go to a market and figure out, what else is out there. If they feel well taken care of and they're getting under a benchmark, that's typically a check the box type of thing once a year. As far as reselling yourselves, you'd be surprised how many sponsors from a year-to-year basis, they're like, who does what again? Who's like, what does the TPA do? What functions do they cover? Understanding those service providers and, what roles they play makes the sponsor feel way better about their plan, and they know who to go to for certain things. So that's one of the big things we review is how are the service providers? Do you understand who's doing what? Who does the 5500 versus who's doing, statements and website access, especially if you have unbundled plans with record keepers and TPAs. Same thing, talking about the clients and their needs. That's one of the first things we talk about in investment committee is one, how's operationally, is there any service provider issues? Is there anything you need us to cover? Two, here's your costs. Three, is there anything that you feel like you need to have happen, whether it be participant education in some way, shape, or form, ADP refunds. Oh, can we look at safe harbor again? You might have that same safe harbor conversation 3-4 times with a client before they say, yeah, this makes sense, right? So continually bringing up the same things, but a lot of times it makes that client feel warmer for an advisor.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a couple minutes for some questions. So if anybody has any, and I'm also going to launch a little poll here. If there are other topics you'd love to hear us cover in the future, we would love to hear those from you. We'd love to have you share those with us, and that would be helpful for us because we want to bring you content that is important to you or helps you in your practice or however that works. So you can put questions in the chat or Q&A. If you could answer this for us, we'd love to have you do this. While you're doing that, also, I'd love to say thank you to Quintan for being here today, and to all of you for being here today and listening to us. And we hope you got good information from it. So.
Yeah, so we tried to answer questions as they popped up. I know there weren't too many, so either that means Theresa and I did a really good job, or you guys have fallen asleep on us. I'm not sure which, but hopefully it's
no, we got a few people answering the poll, so I'm pretty happy about that. But we'll leave it up for another minute or so. But again, thank you guys so much for coming. Learning about conducting effective retirement plan committee meetings. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me or Quintan. We are happy to answer those. Again, thank you all for coming. I know a few of you are still answering, so I'm going to end the poll. I'll give it another minute or so, and then we'll end the webinar. So thank you again.